Hey, happy 2026, everybody. I'm Brian Bledsoe, host of the Desert Farmer podcast. It's great to be with you again in our first episode of 2026. I know it's been a few days since I've spoken with you, but we have had, or at least I've had, quite a bit of stuff going on from a weather standpoint, not only with the seasonal models being updated, but also we've got the storm coming through. For some of us today, we've got some good snow across parts of southern and southeast Colorado, northeast New Mexico, into southwest Kansas, and even the northwest panhandle's getting in the act a little bit. And for those of you thinking, hey, you've got quite the glamorous studio behind you. Yeah. See, this is where I do the Desert Farmer podcast, right from my kitchen table. And after I had the great pleasure of leaving my television career behind, this is what I do. This is my office every morning, right here at the kitchen table, where I get things done, not only for you with the Desert Farmer podcast, but any one of my clients across much of the great American desert. So, and actually, I think I'm going to be getting an office this year. So that's a big development and one that I've been working very hard to get accomplished. So we've got some big things going on in 2026. One of those things right here is just simply kind of changing up the medium a little bit of the Desert Farmer podcast to where I'm making it a little bit more visual. I've had a lot of feedback from folks to say, hey, we would love if you would do that, or can you have us on the show, or whatever. And I am wide open to any of those things for 2026 as we kind of change things up just a little bit. But I've got some good stuff to show you today and some good things to talk about, not only in the short term, but also kind of in the long term, and getting a lot of questions from you folks about that long term forecast, whether it's talking about the transition that's going to take place from La Nina to El Nino, or if, what's going on with the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So, with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to walk you through some of these things today. There's my ugly mug right there. You're live on the Desert Farmer podcast, and what the rundown is going to look like with this is essentially, I'm going to get my pen turned on here as well. We're going to talk a lot about the current pattern, those ENSO changes, which are so important, and also what's going on with the PDO in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Okay. Because for a lot of you, that's been a big question. Are we going to be able to change this Pacific Decadal Oscillation phase that has been so negative for so long? And for those of you that may be new to the Desert Farmer podcast and haven't heard me talk about those things, well, you're in for a treat today because I'm going to talk about exactly just that. Before we get to that, though, let's talk about what the current weather pattern is going to be looking like over the next couple of weeks or so. And the upper level weather pattern, as the European Artificial Intelligence Forecast System sees it. And the European's not updated right now. I'm recording this just after 10 o'clock Mountain Time on your Friday here, but it's going to get us through it. All right. And the pattern that we've got going on right now, I've got a disturbance right there. We've got another disturbance that's obviously touching off the snow across parts of the southern Rockies and the southwest high plains. But this disturbance kind of opens up. Could have been a whole lot bigger if it would have been able to slow down, but as it is, it's going to deliver some much needed moisture for some of us as it makes its way through. But if we put this into motion, I'm going to let this cycle through. This is over the next 2 weeks and what we're going to see. And for those of you that may be new to looking at this, wherever you're seeing the reds and the yellows, that's where we have upper level high pressure in the atmosphere. Wherever you're seeing the blues and even some of the purples and greens, that's where we have upper level low pressure. So upper level high pressure, think warmer, drier. Upper level low pressure, think cooler and more stormy. Not necessarily wet, all right, in some cases, but more stormy. So you can see that there's been quite a pattern flip-flop take place here across the country, with the ridge that's now going to be prevailing across the western, probably third of the United States, and a big deep trough of cold low pressure over the eastern portion of the United States. And it's tough to say what this thing is going to mean in the longer periods, and by longer, like after we get past day 10, 12, or whatever, because it kind of, this trough kind of retrogrades back here to the west and redevelops itself into maybe something new across Southwest Canada and into the Pacific Northwest. But overall, this is going to be kind of the prevailing pattern that we see unfold over the next couple of weeks or so. So what's that going to mean for us? All right. What's that going to mean for us in terms of precipitation anomalies? And this is from, really today right through the 23rd of January. And when we look at what's going on across the country, as I said, just because you have that upper level low pressure doesn't mean it's going to be wet for everybody. And over the eastern part of the country, we've got wetter than average conditions here across the upper Great Lakes, southeast Canada, a little bit right here. But just to the west of that little bullseye here, you've got dryness through this corridor. And that corridor has been fairly dry as of late. This little bullseye here, that's today's storm. Okay, after that, not much of anything. But probably one of the biggest and most noticeable changes that have taken place are the drying out across the west. You know, California and parts of the Pacific Northwest had been so wet for so long, and the next 2 weeks are going to be really dry for that area. And remember, we're skating through the heart of the wet season here in California, which is drought free right now. All right. Thanks to the big deluge of moisture that you had during the back half of December and during the really early part of this month. But the pattern's going to change right there and dry things out in a pretty considerable fashion. And to be honest with you, even right here in the middle part of the country, aside from this storm that's coming through today, this corridor is probably going to be drier than not during that 2 week period because of the weather pattern that I just showed you. From a temperature standpoint, let's look at that. And this would be from the 10th through the 17th. So we are a lot warmer than average, okay, from southwest and south central Canada right through the northern Rockies, the northern plains, and right down through the central and parts of the southwest high plains too. This is nothing really new, but some of these anomalies are less than what they were back in December, where December, through most of the plains was so dry and so very warm. After we get past the 17th, let's look at the 17th through the 23rd. You can see that the influence of that trough over the eastern part of the country and what that does, because that cool air is allowed to come down into the east and the northeast part of the United States versus out here to the west, we're dealing with the warmth across most of the southwest, right along the front range of the Rockies and down into eastern New Mexico and across West Texas. So if you're looking for, aside from today, and today's wintry weather really isn't that wintry by January standards. Could be so much worse in terms of temperatures. But we're really not going to see a whole lot of wintry weather right through this sector. It's just going to kind of be meh, kind of caught in between the big ridge that's out there to the west and the deeper trough that's obviously out there to the east. So that's kind of what we're going to see over the next couple of weeks or so. Let's push beyond that and let's look at what the current state of the oceans looks like, because there's big things happening in the Pacific Ocean right now. And I know that you might have heard some of it recently, but I've been chirping about it here on the Desert Farmer podcast. It's really to all of my clients for the past several months that this was coming. And this is the sea surface temperature anomaly map that I grabbed this morning from a great site. It's Tropical Tidbits with Levi Cohen. Has run a great site for several years. And there's the La Nina that's going on right now. All right. All of that blue is cooler than average sea surface temperature anomalies. That's what La Nina essentially is. There's a couple of areas of the ocean that I'm watching here in addition to La Nina. And I'm going to erase that for you right now. One of those areas is right up here. Okay. Even out here toward Hawaii. I'm really watching this corridor intently because we have warmer than average sea surface temperatures right here along the west coast of North America, down here off the Baja. This is essentially known, or what will be known, because I think this is going to continue, as the positive phase of the Pacific meridional mode. And whenever we have a La Nina event, all right, that's really significant, a lot of times we will get cooling all the way through this sector, all right? This ring of water that's up next to North America and down here off the Baja and all the way out here toward the central equatorial Pacific and west coast of South America, that whole area a lot of times will be cooler than average. So as we're skating through winter here, and this area right up close to North America and out here off the coast of the Baja is warmer than average right now, that's a good thing in my mind, because when we see the Pacific, whether it's the equatorial Pacific or right up there next to the coast of North America, end up being cooler than average, that is a real stout reinforcement of the negative phase of the PDO, which I'm going to talk more about here in a little bit. And that, in many cases, is really hard in the Great American Desert from a precipitation anomaly standpoint. And by that, I'm saying it favors dryness. All right. So if I'm looking at this map and I'm saying, hey, you know what? This La Nina sucks. We're going to get it out of here. All right. But if this whole area, okay, was cooler than average by a lot, I'd be a lot more concerned about how this upcoming transition from La Nina to El Nino is going to go. Because we still have a lot of warmth up here in the North Pacific. And even though we've been cooling a little bit here in the Gulf of Alaska because it's been stormy up here, I'm looking at this sea surface temperature anomaly map this morning, and I'm saying, man, for this time of year, as we go through the middle of winter and come out of winter and head towards spring, I've seen a lot worse looking sea surface temperature anomaly maps from past years. So that's one bit of optimism that I'm looking at right now. The other bit of optimism that I'm looking at, and this is a zonal wind map, if you will. Okay. And I grabbed it back from January 7th. It's the same story, basically, but this is going to go through the 21st. And I grabbed this back a couple of days ago because I wanted to show you something. And all of this right here, okay, all of that blue, those are enhanced easterly trade winds. And those enhanced easterly trade winds maintain and even can, in some cases, develop La Nina events further. But after we get past the middle of the month or even enter the middle of the month, look at this. You see that? That is a really stout westerly wind burst. And I posted this on Twitter just the other day, and I sent this out to my clients too, that this configuration of the trade winds, okay, where we put an end to these stout and persistent easterly trade winds, and then bring about a big westerly wind burst from the middle of January through the end of this month, that, my friends, is the death knell to this La Nina event that's been going on. And another bit of evidence that you see right here, this is looking from along the equatorial Pacific, from the surface all the way down to 450 meters. And over here on the left side, think of this as Indonesia. Over there in the West Pacific. Over here on the right side, think of this as the west coast of South America. So what you're seeing here is all of this warmer than average water that's been pooled up in the West Pacific, okay? With the end of those sea surface or those stout easterly trade winds, what happens is with a westerly wind burst, that warmer than average water can make its way eastward. It's undercutting those cool sea surface temperature anomalies that are closer to the surface. And you can see how this pattern is eroding the current La Nina. It is essentially in the final stages of itself from a sea surface temperature anomaly standpoint. Now, we still have a few things to work out here in terms of the atmosphere and how the atmosphere essentially responds to these changes and whatnot. But if you are looking to put an end to a La Nina event, this is definitely the way to do it. The last update on that was December 29th, and I think it'll probably be even more pronounced the next update because we're going to see those westerly wind bursts kick in and push this warmer than average water across the equatorial Pacific in even more of a stout fashion. Now, if we look at the current Niño 3.4 index, all right, and what we're looking at here, you've got Niño 3.4 index down to -1 or almost -1.1, all right? But you can see it maxed out here late November. It's maxed out again recently in late December, and then we've kind of come up a little bit and maintained itself. Over the next several weeks, I would expect this to be doing this, all right? We are rapidly, I think, going to change out of this event and push toward an El Nino event going forward. Now, the latest European seasonal model, sea surface temperature anomaly forecast, all right, this just came out a few days ago, focuses on what is going to happen over the next several months. It takes us into July, all right? All of these red lines are different members of the European seasonal model looking at the same thing. And you can see, even if we were to just take the average, all right, the average of these lines, you're going to skate through something about like this, okay, right about there. And maybe even a little bit higher, okay? But just the average takes us here into a +1 degree Celsius by July. That firmly puts us into El Nino. And I think this transition is probably going to take place even a little bit more quickly. All right. I think we may even be living a little bit more up here by the end. So you can see how rapidly that line goes up from where we are right now. And that essentially means that we are probably only going to have a small period of time where we're technically in ENSO neutral. And by that, I mean where we are going to essentially reside between positive zero point 0.5 and negative zero point 0.5. That's neutrality right there. Anything above positive zero point 0.5, we're pushing into El Nino territory. Anything below negative zero point 0.5, we are pushing down there into La Nina territory. So this type of transition occurs very rapidly from a computer model standpoint. Now, could there be flaws in this forecast? Could it be too soon or too late or whatever? Sure, there could be, but the trend is undeniable when you see every single one of these model members living up here, especially by late spring and into summer. And historically speaking, when we see these ENSO transitions that take place during the late winter and spring, that a lot of times can make for some pretty active weather in the middle part of the country. This is something that I've been talking about for quite some time, folks, here on the Desert Farmer Podcast. So I know you know exactly what I'm talking about if you're a loyal listener. Here's the sea surface temperature anomaly map that maps out that trend that I just showed you. This starts in January, this month, ends in July. So again, watch right there and the changes that happen. All that blue goes away, and we see it rapidly transition into that orange and that red while we go through the spring and into early summer. Now, while I'm watching that, I'm also watching, remember, this area right here. All right. And that area right there, I see more warmth than not. And a lot of times, whenever we have that region being warmer than average, we usually don't have to worry too much about moisture across the Great Plains. There are always different caveats. There are always different things that pop up in the subseasonal forecast that can influence this. All right. But as purely a table setter here, if we are talking about a fast move toward El Nino and a positive, okay, or a warm Pacific meridional mode right there, and we don't have any substantial cooling up here from the Gulf of Alaska down the west coast of North America, you know what that kind of looks like? It kind of looks like maybe a flip toward the positive phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And I'm not completely ready to go there at all. All right. I'm not, because it's been a long time since we have seen the positive phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation persist. And I've just been kind of theorizing and just in my head and talking to a few of you about this over the past few months that if we can get a big enough pop from this El Nino, can we also get a big enough pop that it finally pushes this PDO phase, this Pacific Decadal Oscillation phase, into at least neutral, but more importantly, into positive? And while I'm not 100% sold on it yet, I think there's some things here to watch. And I think that there's some reason for some optimism. Let's look at how over the past 25 years, we're going to look at the Oceanic Niño Index. All right. So this is a measure of strength when it comes to La Nina and El Nino events. So we're going to start at 2000. Okay. Over here. You see the letters here, the months, December, January, February. Okay. January, February, March, all the way over here to November, December, January. And if we look at the past and just simply look at where the October, November, December Oceanic Niño Index was, just in 2025. And we're down here to negative 0.5. So let's look at history in the past history here to see what years have been close to us where we are going to be going from a La Nina to an El Nino in that transition. All right. October, November, December. How about 2022? Okay. 2022, we were in La Nina. We rapidly, look at 23 over here, we rapidly saw La Nina come to an end in early 2023. By February, March, April, that Oceanic Niño Index was zero. And then look what we did in 23. we rapidly transitioned into a really stout El Nino event. All right. So if we are looking for past years, analog years, as to what we're going to see, 2023 is a good place to start. It's a really good place to start. Let's also look back here at 2018. 2018, December, January, February, the oceanic Niño index was a negative 0.8. We may get to that level in that November, December, January update, but we're going to be similar. And then by later in 2018, we went to an El Nino. That El Nino really didn't pop here in 2018 until August, September, October. All right. But it popped. Not as fast as that transition in 23. All right. Let's keep looking beyond this. All right. How about 2009? 2009 pretty much was kind of a middle ground between 2023 and 2018 as far as that transition. We technically made it to that El Nino threshold in June, July, August of that oceanic Nino update in 2009. All right. So we made it there. Another year, how about 2002? 2002, we did the same thing. 2002, again, I don't think that oceanic Nino index was as low as where we are right now. But just over the past 25 years, those are some years I really think to focus on for what's lying ahead in 2026, where we saw that transition from a La Nina real early in the year to an El Nino. And I think out of all of these, I think that we may be leaning more toward a 2023 type transition versus those other years that I've just mentioned. I still think that those other years are important in terms of how we do this La Nina to El Nino transition in 26. But if you want to believe the European model, the European seasonal model that I just showed you, it would probably more closely mirror 2023 as far as a rapid transition versus these other years. Certainly a lot of work to do here, all right, in terms of what I'm looking at going forward over the year to see just how quickly we're going to transition and to see, quite frankly, how we're going to come out with some of these other subseasonal forecast elements. So I think that's important. Pretty significant stuff right there. All right. Let's push beyond that and let's look at the decadal oceanic oscillation update. And by that, I'm saying what phase of PDO and AMO that we're in. PDO stands for Pacific Decadal Oscillation. I've talked about that at length. And the AMO, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. We're going to look at the PDO first of all. All right. For those of you that haven't ever seen this before, these are the different phases of the PDO. And I apologize for the graininess of the graphic here a little bit. But up here is the US and North America. All right, you can see it right there. And during a warm phase of a PDO, you have this whole area, this warm horseshoe, if you will, from the Gulf of Alaska down the west coast of North America, and then usually prevailing out here along the equator. Your coldest water is over here in the West Pacific. Now, this is the difference now in present day versus, say, 25 years ago or so. The old PDO, okay, used to be more pronounced with these cold pools over here in the warm phase or these warmer pools over here in the negative phase. But right now, we are still technically in this phase where we have this cold horseshoe, all right, and the warmth that's over here in the north and the northwest portion and the west portion of the Pacific Ocean. Now, I've shown you sea surface temperature anomaly maps before where it just looks like a blowtorch all across the North Pacific. All right. There are some things to think about there is to say, well, what has caused those changes? Well, for one of them, there's less shipping traffic in the North Pacific than there's been before, which means less aerosol production, which means less cloud cover, which means more sunlight, which means you have a net positive or a net warming of that body of water. So the temperature differences in these phases, okay, and I've talked a lot about this on Twitter with some of you too, has to be reevaluated in present day versus what they used to be before. For instance, a truly negative, okay, Pacific Decadal Oscillation has that bigger temperature difference across the North Pacific versus what we're seeing right now. And a true warm phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, you see how it says cooler here? It may not be colder than average water. It just simply may be cooler, relatively speaking, to what the ocean temperatures are along the west coast of North America and out there in the equatorial Pacific. All right. But that's the differences in the phases. All right. And down here with the El Nino and Southern Oscillation, this is what an El Nino looks like over in the lower left. This is what a La Nina looks like over here on the right. All right. They're just kind of very similar. Okay. The El Nino and the La Nina are kind of shorter time scales of what the longer time scale is of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. By that, I mean a 20, 30 year cycle versus maybe an every other year or every other couple of years cycle down here with El Nino and La Nina. I hope that makes sense because it's an important thing that we have to focus on. If we look at what's gone on since 1854, and I know that that is a grain of sand in terms of geologic time, all right, but it's what we have to work with and it's what we have to use here. So when I look at the Pacific Decadal Oscillation all the way back to 1854, all right, and to present day, you obviously have the warm phases and the cool phases. Warm phases, those are the red spikes. Cool phases, those are the blue spikes. And you can kind of pick some things out here, but I'm gonna break this down for you by looking at this. This is from 1948 to 1976. And from 1948 through 76, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation was cold. And I firmly believe that this phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation produced one of the more significant droughts in the Great Plains in history, the 1950s, right? In many cases, the 1950s were worse than the 1930s. It's just that we were so much better farmers and at soil conservation in the 50s than we were the 30s that a lot of people, they forget about the 50s. But if you talk to some older folks, okay, about what the 1950s were like in the Great Plains, you want to hear some things, man, I'll tell you, some extremes to say the least. And I think the thing to take home with this phase that went through the heart of the 50s, that just because the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is in a negative phase doesn't mean you can't have an El Nino. Okay. We had one here in 57, and it was a pretty good one. And look what the Pacific Decadal Oscillation phase did here from late 56 through about the middle of 58. All right. That phase right there, or that pop, if you will, of the PDO really took us out of some really harsh drought conditions of the mid 50s, and it gave us 1957. 1957, I remember my grandmother talking about how she talked about how we went from blowing dirt in the pastures to 3 foot of snow on the level during that late fall and into the start of 1957. Just some really wild stuff happened back then, and that PDO pop eventually went away by 1960. You see it come down here again. And then we largely lived in that negative PDO state, all right, from 1960 all the way to 1976. We had another PDO pop right there, right around 1970, but that was pretty short lived. We went right back down into that negative PDO. And some of those years, some of those winters in the 70s were absolutely brutal. And some of the La Nina events that occurred while the PDO was so negative really helped facilitate some of those brutal winters in the 70s. But that's a snapshot here of the last negative cycle or cold cycle of the PDO before the one we're presently in. All right, 48 through 76. So what happened in terms of precipitation anomalies? Well, from January to December, I just did the whole year from 48 to 76. Wherever you're seeing the yellows and the oranges, that's where we had drier than average conditions. The precipitation anomalies averaged out to be negative during that period of time. And the only areas that were positive were up here in the Pacific Northwest, parts of Idaho, Northwest Montana, and the Southeast. All right. Very La Nina like configuration, by the way. And it should be because from 48 to 76, we saw more La Nina events than we did El Nino events. But the heart of the plains, most of the Great American Desert, ended up being drier than average. We were really drier than average. Southern Arizona, New Mexico, Southwest Texas, this corridor here across Oklahoma through East Texas. And there were some good years to go along with those bad years, but the main message here is that there were more bad years, and the bad years were really bad. Some of those bad years were historic than there were good years in terms of moisture. This is what happened from 1976 through 1998. Looks a lot different, right? Well, the PDO changed. A lot of folks refer to this change in the mid to late 70s as the Great Climatic Shift, where the PDO came out of that negative phase, it went positive, and it stayed very positive through that whole time frame. And for those of you that have ever heard me speak, and I've talked here also on the Desert Farmer podcast, the 90s, okay, uh, are often referred to as the golden age of agriculture in the Western High Plains because you really didn't have too much to worry about in terms of moisture. But really, while I know that there were some drought years here over this 22-year period, there were more wet years than dry years in here. All right. Some of those dry years were pretty nasty in the upper Midwest. All right. In fact, some late 90s, or I should say some late 80s, early 90s dryness, okay, right in that sector, were pronounced across parts of the Corn Belt. But these were much shorter lived than they were previously. And if you look at some of the early 90s stuff, all right, tornado activity, rain activity in the Great Plains, it was pretty significant. These are the precipitation anomalies, January to December, 76 to 98, while the PDO is in a net warm or positive phase. All that green and blue, yeah, wetter than average conditions. In stark contrast to what I just showed you from that period from 48 through 76. Pretty significant, right? And even up here in the Pacific Northwest that was wetter, they dried out. There's areas of west and northwest Montana, they dried out. The areas of the southeast part of the country, not as wet. All right. They had some pretty dry years in there. This is where we are right now. PDO phase from May of 98 to present, to December of 25. We've only had very few pops of PDO here in the warm phase. All right. One of the more recent ones took place back here in 14 and lingered into 16. That also helped to produce one of the stronger El Nino events that we've had recently. The other one happened back in 1997. We had an El Nino event in 23. Remember I talked about that? Did it pop the PDO positive? No. In fact, it was stayed very negative during that last El Nino event that we had in 2023. Pretty crazy, right? Because usually you will have a pop in that PDO that kind of mirrors what's going on with the El Nino. As I said, they kind of work together in that regard. The PDO pops positive, well, makes an El Nino more likely. During phases of warm or positive PDO, we usually have more frequent or longer lasting El Nino episodes. During a negative or cold PDO, we many times have more frequent La Ninas and more strong La Ninas than before. And recently here, the PDO has been very negative. All right. But from 98 through 25, these are the precipitation, and actually through 24, because 25 stats aren't completely in. So what I did is I did January to December, 98 to 24. Look at all the dryness here. Look at the dryness through this corridor. All right. Right up the middle through this corridor here. All right. Even down here across parts of the Gulf Coast. All right. Very similar to what I showed you before from 48 to 76 for some of those areas. But even more noticeably, the Pacific Northwest, Northern California have been drier. Northwest Montana, Northern Idaho, drier. That's different from what we witnessed before. But historically speaking, this 26-year period, okay, there have been many more dry years than there have been wet years in the middle part of the country. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation since 19, or I should say since 2020 through present, looks like this. As I said, in 23, we had that El Nino. No positive pop here, the PDO. In fact, it was very negative. Precipitation anomalies during that time frame, January to December, 2020 through 24. Look at these stout dry anomalies in the midsection, especially up here across the Western Corn Belt. Very significant dry anomalies right there with what the PDO has been doing. So you see the importance of it. It's significant. And the Atlantic also has a similar oscillation, although they quit tracking it, the phase of the AMO, back in 2023. But this goes all the way back to 56. And you might say, well, then what phase are we in right now? We are in still a positive AMO or a warm AMO. And the last time we flipped that was 1996. So since 96, we've been in a warm or positive Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. The significance of this is drought frequency. McCabe put this together several years ago, and it still rings very true. From 48, okay, or not even from 48, but from 76 to 98, we lived up here. All of that bluish purple reduced drought frequency. And it's not a perfect roadmap. Okay, it gets us close. But this is what we witnessed. This is what I witnessed when I grew up. I was born in 74. All right. So when I was growing up on the ranch, this was the phase that I remember where we didn't have to worry about rain most of the time. But after we switched from 98 to this awful thing down here in the lower right. And this is where we've been living since 1998, right here. So all of that red is enhanced drought frequency, and it's really been spot on across the Southwest, the Four Corner states, parts of the Western High Plains. The Corn Belt hasn't suffered as much, okay? And we've even had sporadic droughts up here across parts of Montana and in the Western Dakotas, all right? But the drought frequency is really enhanced across the Western and Southern High Plains and westward through the desert Southwest with this configuration. Now, where do we go from this? All right. I don't think that the AMO is ready to pop yet and change phases. So what we might end up doing is we might end up detouring up here where we have a warm Pacific and a warm Atlantic for a while. And what that does is that shifts drought frequency and enhancement farther north, all right, and greatly lessens it across the Southwest and across the Southern Plains. Again, if you live in Eastern Colorado, Western Kansas, parts of the Panhandles, and northward, you're still probably not in a great spot because that positive AMO still has an impact, okay? It still has an impact on facilitating higher than average drought frequency right there. But eventually, because we've been in this negative PDO since 98, and because we've been in this warm AMO since 96, eventually, I do feel like we are going to return to this up here, where we have a warm PDO and a negative or a cold AMO. Interesting, right? When I talk to farmers and ranchers, especially young farmers and ranchers, a lot of them have only known this negative PDO, positive AMO, the drought. They've only known that. They never got to experience this up here. And I know some of the old timers have experienced both and have seen the transitions between the two, and sometimes the extreme weather that we have seen in both, whether it was the extreme drought of the 50s or the amazing flooding that happened in the spring of 1965, or the tremendous droughts in South Texas from late 10 through 13. And then we flipped it on its end and we had that El Nino in 15 and we had all the water that we wanted. You know, so there's extremes built in with these on both sides of the coin. But if we're looking at what's important in that 20 to 30 year cycle, I'll tell you what, if I'm a farmer or a rancher that still works in the Great Plains, something like this up here, a transition to this in the upper left is extremely important to me. But we also have to recognize what might happen before we go to something like that. Okay. None of this is set in stone. It's something that we have to look at and recognize, at least in my opinion. Okay. It just is. And I've been looking at this stuff for the majority of my life. And I always found it extremely important to bring it back to agriculture. Obviously because that's my heritage. And that's what I like pairing with weather is something like this and this type of analysis. So I know I speak to you a lot on the Desert Farmer podcast about this stuff, but if there's something that I can do for you, and I talk about this all the time, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. All right. That's my phone number. That's my email address. I have several clients scattered throughout the Great Plains, individual folks, farmers, ranchers, also different companies or whatever. I will work and talk to anybody that feels like this type of stuff is important. Okay. Because to me, it's very important. It was important to my family when I sat down with them in the late 90s and early 2000s and told them what they were going to have to prepare for going forward for that quarter century where we've had more lean years than we've had good years. But I'm a realist, all right, with sprinkled in with a little bit of optimism. My optimism is I'm really excited for what this El Nino event could possibly mean for the long term. I still think, even with this transition from La Nina to El Nino, be careful what you wish for. All right. Because not every El Nino brings the same impacts as some others, and vice versa with the La Nina episode too. So I think we're going to have maybe a little bit of time here in the spring where we still have to skate through some dryness before we can really see the effects. I'm going to talk more about that on another episode of the Desert Farmer podcast because for the first half of the month we get all the new seasonal model information in, and I kind of analyze that and I package that together. But again, I'm kind of optimistic for the first time in a long time about maybe the PDO flipping and changing to something that's, if nothing else, isn't as negative and as drought producing as what we've seen over the past several years. Okay. Folks, it is always a pleasure to talk to you here in this medium on the Desert Farmer podcast. And I hope you enjoy the content. I hope you enjoy the visuals here. Again, I think it's a very important topic, especially for those that look into the longer range type of thing and may not have known about this stuff. For years, I've thought it never gets enough run in the agricultural community, so I kind of made it, my thing to try to help out. So if you've got any questions, if you've got any comments, if you've got any feedback for me, you saw how to contact me. I welcome it with open arms because it helps me be better every single day. I hope you folks are well. I hope you're getting some snow on your wheat with this little brush of winter right here. And I'm going to be chatting with you again real soon here on the Desert Farmer Podcast. Here's to having a great 2026. Take care.